Welcome to A Slice of SEL, a podcast for educators about social emotional learning.
Welcome to A Slice of SEL. We're the SEL services team at the St. Croix River Education District. I'm Nick.
I'm Rye.
And we are missing our BFF, Courtney, this week, but we are ecstatic to be joined by David Jackson. David is a beloved school social worker, and he works at Pine City Elementary School and supports Pine City schools. Welcome, David.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
We're so happy you're here. We don't have guests on the podcast too often, so this is really a tremendous treat. And we also can't thank David enough for joining us on very short notice. I reached out to David yesterday with kind of a Hail Mary, and you just didn't hesitate to jump up and help us out. So thank you so much, David.
It's my pleasure. The topic we're talking about is one that really resonates with me.
Yeah, and that topic was not a last minute thought. The topic of this episode is motivational interviewing, and we've been talking to David for months about doing this. We were just happy that the schedules all came together on short notice. So motivational interviewing is a set of tools that help us to enhance a student's change talk and help them find their internal motivation to solve a problem by coming up with and following through on a plan that they're committed to. And this has always been an important topic. But in the last 12 months or so during the pandemic, one of the big issues we've been facing in education is student engagement, because the support structures of physically getting on the bus, going to school, having contact with the supportive adults who are going to encourage students, help them stay on track with their learning, that was affected in a big way by the pandemic and distance learning. And our students needed that internal motivation more than ever. So we are very excited to have David here and have a chance to learn more about motivational interviewing.
But before that, let's talk about what's filling our bucket this week. David, as our guest, we'd love for you to go first. So can you tell us what's filling your bucket today?
I'd say we just have seen the sun today. It was a very small thing, and yet seeing the sun this morning was really just nice to see after the kind of a rainy week, and that the weather's getting a little bit warmer. That is Friday, and also that is Friday, and that I get to spend the weekend with my kids. So just looking forward to some quality time with those two.
Wonderful. You may have listened to the podcast before, but talking about the weather is one of my favorite things that fill my bucket too. So I connect with you on that.
And I was actually at Pine City Elementary School yesterday, and my drive there and back were wonderful. Just that beautiful Minnesota spring weather. My bucket is overflowing this week because we released the new core edition of Be Good People, our SEL curriculum, about a week ago. And those are like slimmed down, simplified lessons that are going to work really well in those skinny blocks at Tier 1. And my team of Rye, Court, and Rachel helped me design it. Plus, we got amazing input from the teacher teams in the member districts. And it's been received so positively. And I'm just so busy working with schools who are planning to use it next fall. So it's just so exciting and really filling my bucket all week.
Yeah, it is so exciting. And I think I mentioned last week that it's so cool to see how many people it's reaching and how many people it's having a positive impact on. So for me, I think what's filling my bucket is this weekend, my husband and I are celebrating our anniversary. It was 8 years last week. And throughout the week, I think maybe I've said good morning and good night to him. So we've just been kind of passing each other in the hallway, I feel like all week. So I'm just excited to spend some time with him.
Oh, congratulations, Rye.
Thanks.
Well, we're going to shift into motivational interviewing. David, I know I mentioned in the intro that you're currently a school social worker and you support Pine City schools, but I know that's not your only job. It's not your whole career. So could you just share with us a bit more about your work and the hats that you wear?
Sure. So I am a school social worker through the St. Croix River Education District, and I'm contracted to work with Pine City Elementary as their behavior access or halftime behavior access, halftime school social worker. So at a school level, I work with a lot of behaviors, kind of at that tier 2 level, so that next level up, running social skill groups and individual social skills at the school, and then just doing some general counseling as well. And then I have an additional role with Therapeutic Services Agency, also known as TSA, as an outpatient therapist. So one of the tracks I went down about 5 years ago was to become a clinical social worker, so I could practice therapy as well. So I've got a clinical lens as well as in-school lens. So those are my two main roles.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting that, David. I think that kind of relationship, like the work you do with TSA and in the schools, is really helpful is maybe not the right word, but just helpful for understanding motivational interviewing, because I'm not an expert in it at all, but I know that it's not a tool set, not a set of skills that's only utilized in schools. I think it's used in, community social work, mental health work, treatment therapy out in the community as well, correct?
Yes, it can be used a lot across a lot of different settings. So healthcare, obviously in schools, in therapy, there's a little bit more to it in therapy. There's more of the therapeutic aspect of it, but really general counseling wise, pretty much anybody can do motivational interviewing if they have the skill set and they have the right mentality about how they're working with the person. So it's kind of cool is that you don't have to be a therapist to do motivational interviewing. You can really do it. You can do it in many different settings.
I'm glad you mentioned healthcare, because that just reminded me, when I was making breakfast this morning, I was searching my podcast app for any other episodes that are out there about motivational interviewing. And one of them was about dentistry. And I think it was a dentistry podcast where they were talking about motivational interviewing. And I have an appointment coming up to fill some cavities because I don't floss enough. TMI, but I just think it's so relatable that dentists would have to have this skill set to kind of help their clients find the internal motivation to do good dental care.
Twice a day, every day, Nick.
Yeah, a really good illustration of your point about, you don't have to be a therapist to do this. So let's get into it. I'm not an Oprah Winfrey here, so not an experienced interviewer. So we're just going to start simple and just ask if you could remember kind of when or where you first heard of motivational interviewing, David, and just what kind of your first exposure to it was and what made you want to learn more about it.
Yeah, so I kind of think I have two times where I was really exposed to it. The first time was really that introductory to motivational interviewing. That was by Cheryl McHugh. So she's the executive director at TSA, and she was supervising me for my social work license. So social workers have to have a little bit extra licensure supervision from actual social workers. Anyways, she must have seen something in me and thought motivational interviewing might be a good fit with my personality. So she introduced it to me. She gave me a PowerPoint. I read through it, didn't really understand it very well, to be honest with you. I understand it to a degree, but it's a pretty complex thing just to look at a PowerPoint and try to understand. But she kind of planted that seed. The next time I heard it, which was about a year later, I was in graduate school, and for my groups class, motivational interviewing was the intervention that we were practicing and using in that class. So I got the chance to really dive in and chew on the material and learn about it a little bit more, and it really just started to resonate with me the more and more I learned about it.
I love that you mentioned that part about getting a PowerPoint, because that's my level of expertise. I think that's kind of like the first step is you go to a conference or something, you get that PowerPoint, maybe a handout about the practice, and then you get a Google Drive folder with that stuff in it. And then that's kind of where I've stuck with it. So I'm excited to have someone who knows a lot more about it to kind of help us and our listeners maybe get past that first step.
Hope I can be of help.
So in your experience, David, where is motivational interviewing fitting in schools? When are people using it, and who is typically leading motivational interviewing?
Well, I might be jumping ahead, but motivational interviewing is really a conversation about change. And there's more to it than that, but it's really when a behavioral change needs to occur or would be of benefit for the person to change. So like Nick said, with flossing his teeth, that would be.
I like that we're not dropping that.
We'll just loop back to that, but that would be something that you could use motivational interviewing for, because it's a change that if it was important enough to Nick to change or to make, we could use motivational interviewing to hopefully help Nick make that change or enhance his motivation to make that change himself. So really classroom behavior, it can work in, any negative behavior. It's about working with the kid and figuring out what's that internal motivation for them to change. Counselors can often use it for those type of things. But homework completion, classroom behavior, attendance and truancy, pretty much any behavior that needs to change to make that student more successful. So whether it's showing up to class or being present in class. And as far as who can use it, it really can be utilized by anybody. It doesn't have to be a social worker or a counselor or a school psychologist. It can be used by a teacher. The tricky part is it is an intervention that takes conversation. So in the teacher's case where they don't have a lot of room for that conversation, it would be kind of those micro moments where they can put a little or motivational interviewing. I'm going to call it MI for short, just so you know, I might say that. But they can maybe use MI in a micro way to just, nudge a student in the right direction, just to make the student think about a change that would be possible for them to make.
That makes me think of a pretty popular intervention in our schools is Check and Connect. It's a program, designed at the U of M, and it's like a long-term mentoring program. So like a paraprofessional or a teacher might be paired up with a student and be their mentor for a longer period of time. And it's aimed at disengagement. So truancy is part of that, like low work completion. And the more I think about it, I swear I've heard MI in that context specifically, because it's really good fit for that as well.
Yeah, in Pine City, we had the opportunity to get a couple of different staff trained. So we've had some paraprofessionals trained, EBD teachers trained, the counselors trained. So and just I think we had a gym teacher. So really, I mean, any role they can use it. Just the amount they can use it depends on how much conversation they can have with the student in their particular role.
Well, I think if our listeners are with us at this point, they're probably interested, and they probably want us to shift to that how. So what would be your elevator speech? I know that's a tough ask for something that's, as nuanced as this, but elevator speech for kind of how motivational interviewing works. Like, what are the main ingredients in it? I believe that there tends to be some kind of pre-interview or pre-meeting work and some follow-up work. But for the sake of this question, if we could maybe just highlight the actual interview process first.
Sure. So it's gonna vary depending on where you're at with the student or with the client. It's gonna really depend on where they're at with their change, or what the change that we want to work on. So sometimes students are not aware of the change. So technically, are really talking about the change in that context. So we call that pre-contemplation. So if a student is not showing up to school and they don't really see the big deal why they have to show up to school, motivational interviewing might not be helpful in that situation, at least as the skill set. But motivational interviewing also has what's called the spirit. And the spirit is really important. The spirit is a way of being with a person. So when we're using motivational interviewing and we're in that spirit, we're having a collaborative conversation style to strengthen that person's own motivation and commitment to change. And the spirit consists of 4 domains as if you're using it when you're talking to somebody, which is partnership, working with the person, right? So we don't want to put power over that person. So we don't want to make that person do anything. So there's this partnership with the person. How can we work together to make this change? If that's indeed something you want. Acceptance of that person's autonomy. So acceptance is the second pillar of the spirit of MI. And we want to accept their autonomy, that they are a person who has free will and can make those choices themselves. And we can't really change those choices, but we can hopefully influence those choices through motivational interviewing. Compassion, just kind of accepting where that person's at with the change, whether they're in that pre-contemplation or they've actively made that change and are now, in the planning and the maintenance, or the activation and maintenance phase, which is another 2 stages of the change. So we want to have compassion and evocation. So we're trying to evoke from the person more about what the changes they want to make are. So once we have figured out what the change is, evoking from them the reasons and how they could make those changes. So I would start with that. And the first step is always engagement. So we don't want to push the skill set of motivational interviewing before we have that engagement done. And I think that's in most cases with students and clients. You want to first have a good foundational relationship before you're pushing the intervention.
So if you were talking to a student about, you observed that there was a truancy issue, for example, and that engagement really wasn't there yet, and they didn't have that understanding that the problem really was a problem, like what would be the first kind of step to create that engagement, or to kind of draw them to that understanding that there is a change that might need to be made here?
Yeah, so in motivational interviewing, we really want to use open questions to help them explore that. So if they're not aware that there's a problem and we can clearly see a problem, we can kind of think of questions, like open questions, to really draw out what's going on in that person's life, so that we can help them start to identify that there might be a problem. So a kid's not attending school, they don't see the reason why they need to attend school. And depending where they're at developmentally is going to be really important, because MI is not necessarily a great intervention if a kid if a kid isn't all there with language, like just there, it's a conversation. So really below fifth grade, it can be difficult. Now, I'm not saying you can't do it below fifth grade, but it's a bit slower. So you really want them to be able to articulate and verbalize what's going on. But by using open questions, we can hopefully draw out some ambivalence, right? So ambivalence, and I always tell the kids, like, when they're kind of thinking about the change, it's like having the devil on one shoulder and the angel on the other shoulder. That's that ambivalence working off of each other, right? That really resonates with them. It's easy for them. They see that in cartoons and stuff. So on one hand, the devil's saying, you don't need to go to school. We don't need that. And the angel's saying, what is the angel saying? Because what the angel's saying, that's the change talk. So evoking that from them can start moving them towards that change, even if it's just a little bit towards that change, even if they're not there. So I think I answered your question there, Nick.
Yeah, and I think if I'm, again, I'm complete novice, but I know the OARS acronym is part of that skill set of motivational interviewing. And you mentioned open-ended questions, and that's the first O, the O in the OARS. And I think I heard an example there in your answer when you're talking about the devil and the angel, and you kind of asked, like, what is the angel saying? That's an example of an open-ended question. Like, they tend to start with the what, how, could, would. And I also heard there was a little bit of research that, like, tell or could you tell me is also an example of kind of an open-ended question that has that same kind of impact on someone.
Yeah, and I think I would think of it very much like you're doing right now, Nick. You're doing an interview, right? It's to draw out from the person you're interviewing the information. It's not, me with a student, I could tell the student all the reasons why they should come to school, but my reasons aren't necessarily going to be that good, right? So those open questions is really to draw that out. And another good point is we want to stick with open questions, but we don't want closed questions. We don't want those yes or no's, because what happens with those, at least with me, one of my struggles has been, like, I ask a yes or no question, which is a closed-ended question, and then I ask another one and another one. It's kind of addicting, and then it ends up being more of an interrogation almost. So I really want to make people think with those open questions so that they have to process and then verbalize why they're doing what they're doing.
We've talked a little bit about that on the podcast before. I can't remember the episode number, but we did an episode called Compassion and Listening, and it was really about the empathetic listening skill set, the different things that you use. And we talked a little bit about how when you are find yourself lecturing and asking a lot of closed questions, we kind of train that student to respond that way. So even when we need information from them, like we're sitting down at the table and we're like, I don't get how we're going to solve this problem. Like, I need you to be part of it. I need, you to talk and tell us what's going to work. Like, we've trained them so well to say yes or no's and respond in short little bits and be pretty quiet that it's tough to get them to open up at that point.
Yeah, absolutely. It kind of feels like an interrogation, or it can start to feel like an interrogation,
Yeah.
And just to kind of, like, use an example, if we can go back to the flossing there, Nick, just to kind of give an example of what the difference would be.
You go for it, David.
All right. So if I ask Nick, should you floss? There's a closed question. Nick, how would you answer?
Yes.
Yes. And then a lot of times, especially with kids, that's all they're going to answer, right? They're going to say yes, and that's going to be done. And then you got to ask another question. So if I asked a question instead, like, Nick, what benefits have you heard about flossing? And we don't have to go into that.
Yeah.
I'm not going to get a yes or no. I'm going to get more information about your ambivalence to why you should do that, right?
Yeah.
Then I can use the skill sets, which are those OARS, affirmations, reflections, and summarizations, to hopefully amplify that those motivations for you to change.
Well, and you just mentioned the rest of the OARS, so let's move on to those. So let's talk about the A, affirmations. Yeah,
affirmations. And I know I mentioned affirmations within the spirit, and it's a little bit different than this. So affirmations are motivational interviewing is a strength-based approach. So we want to look for the strength in the individual. So an affirmation would be a strength you see in that person. So they're organized, they're hardworking, they're charismatic, whatever that is. People have strengths, and drawing out that strength. Anytime you get an affirmation, just kind of notice how you feel. And if you're affirming the right thing in a person, they're going to want to do more of those things. So that's the first thing, is affirmations.
Yeah, and I tried to do some pre-interview prep, and part of that was listening to an Irish podcast about motivational interviewing, and there were a couple of takeaways that really resonated with me when they were talking about affirmations. I like the phrase that they used. It's kind of recognizing what's there versus filling in what's missing. And they also highlighted how it's distinct from praise. and they were not dissing praise. They were saying like it has a time and a place. It's great, but it's not the same as doing an affirmation, offering a genuine affirmation. Because one thing they said is, praise is essentially a judgment, because we are highlighting often something that is quote unquote good, but that is also implying that there's the inverse, that like that thing could also be bad. Where affirmations are just recognizing or helping the student to recognize that there's a strength or there's an asset that they have. And they said that can be so powerful, and can actually, when people get a genuine affirmation of a strength that they have, it can release that oxytocin, which is that warm relationship hormone that we get when we get a hug, for example, or like hug a dog.
Yeah. The affirmations are unbelievably helpful tool, and that you can really help when you start helping those people see what those strengths are. It can be very, very helpful. I think one good example would be praise versus that affirmation would be, praise would be just kind of praising the behavior, like good job, getting your workout, or good job showing up to school today. So you're just praising the behavior. And affirmation would more be what's bringing them to school, or what is the strength or the trait that the person has. So if a person's coming to school, is you're persistent, you keep showing up to school, your persistency, you're persistent, or you said you're going to show up to school, you're honest. There's another one. So those are more traits, and that's what we want to look for in affirmations. If you can really get a good one, you can really help that person change.
Yeah, I love that identification of traits, and helping build. It also helps students build their self-awareness, which we talk a lot about with SEL. It's just that understanding of my traits and my values and my beliefs, which aren't things usually at the surface of our minds day to day. So it's really powerful when you can help students to recognize those. But let's jump to reflections and summaries.
Sure. So reflections and summaries are very similar things. So a reflection is just very simply not repeating verbatim what the person said, but kind of catching what they said and then reflecting it back to them. And specifically in motivational interviewing, we're looking for things that would amplify change or change talk. And change talk is, I might be jumping ahead here, but change talk is things that are pro change or for that change. So just to kind of use an example. So if a kid's not going to school, and they're having a conversation with me, and I'm using MI as as the intervention. Maybe the kid says, I hate getting up in the morning. I just want to sleep in, but I miss out on all my schoolwork, and then I'm behind in my classes. All right. So I don't want to reflect on the part where they want to sleep in, because if I reflect on that part, they're going to start talking more about why they want to sleep in and that they're tired and they don't want to get up. I want to reflect or summarize even the other part, which is then the change talk. So you keep falling behind on your work, that it's no fun to be behind in your work, and then you got to stay in for recess. That doesn't sound very, very fun. So I'm just reflecting on what they said, but I'm reflecting on a very specific part of what they said to evoke more of that change talk. And so the reflections and summarizations are very similar. Summarizations are, you really just encapsulate a whole conversation or a paragraph of what the conversation is. And a reflection is just very short, and it can be the feeling even, like, that sounds frustrating. That's a reflection right there too. Mm-hmm. Those two skills or tools within MI are really important, just to keep the conversation going towards change.
Yeah, and I like that phrase, change talk. That's one of the things that really attracts my attention to MI, and a phrase that really jumps out. And I know you mentioned it. Maybe we could dive a little bit more into that and kind of what it is.
Yeah. So there's two types of talk. In MI, there's two types of talk. There's change talk, and then there's sustained talk. So sustained talk is talk that's going to keep that person in that behavior that they want to change. So in the example before, it was that they want to stay home and they want to sleep in, yada, yada, yada. That would be sustained talk. The change talk is when whatever they're saying that is pro change or going towards that change. And actually, we differentiate them into two different type of change talks. There's preparatory and mobilizing, and I'll talk about that a little bit. But when I'm looking for change talk, initially, usually you have preparatory change talk, which is change talk before the behavior has actually changed. And that consists of, and one thing about MI should know that we like to use acronyms. So this acronym is called DARN, D-A-R-N, which is desire, ability, reason, and need. So preparatory change talk, if you hear something that has a desire, like I want to be at school so I don't miss my homework. Ability, I know I can be at school on time. I've done it before. Reason, I want to be able to go up for recess. rather than staying inside and not being with my friends at school. And I need to have good grades. Otherwise, I'm going to lose my cell phone. I'm just kind of, throwing some out there, but that would be preparatory change talk. And eventually what I would want to see, or the hope is that we want to get to mobilizing change talk, which the acronym is CATS, CATS, which is commitment, activation, or action, and taking steps. So again, just to go through the example there, commitment, I'm going to get up at 6 o'clock so I'm to the bus on time. Activation or action, I'm going to lay out my clothes the night before so that I will be ready for school the next day. Taking steps, and that would actually be another example of taking steps. I'm going to make sure that my clothes are laid out so when I get up in the morning, I can put them on and I can get out the door as fast as possible. So you, as an MI person, you're kind of looking for those two different types of change talk, but either change talk is really good, because then if you can evoke more of that, they're going to continue to move towards that change.
So if I'm understanding, and I love both those acronyms, by the way, DARN and CATS, love those. Yep. You're using those OARS tools and, the reflection summarization, for example, to kind of, when you spot those little glimmers of those change talks, to kind of like reflect it back and amplify that. Is that kind of a decent summary?
Yeah. The theory being with MI, people are more willing to listen to themselves, and they have ambivalence, right? They have the angel and they have the devil on the shoulder. They oftentimes see it both ways, and helping them find the reasons that they can change out of their own head, and then just reflecting or summarizing it back to them kind of reinforces those things in their head. So if you have a sustained talk and then you have some change talk and then you get reflected on the change talk, not only is that going to evoke more change talk, but you're also hearing it back to yourself about the reason why you want to change.
So one example of how this comes into play in schools, I think, is a truancy prevention meeting. That's how it's been used in Pine City, from what I understand. Mm-hmm. And would you mind kind of walking us through what MI would look like in a truancy prevention meeting? And I do want to mention before I hand it over that David did just such a phenomenal job putting together a video demo, which educators appreciate so much, actually seeing something being used, of a truancy prevention meeting with MI, and an outline for that. And he was gracious enough to let us, share those out. So we're going to link those into the show notes of the podcast. Very cool. But I'll hand it over to you, David, if we can kind of talk through kind of what that, TPM meeting looks like.
Yeah. So the TPM, Truancy Prevention Meeting, is a meeting that in Pine City we would have kind of right before we would refer to Pine County for truancy, for a truancy referral to the Pine County's attorney's office. And what we do with that is we just try to get all the people at the table, the parents, the kid, and as well as the school professionals who are working on absenteeism with the student. And we just kind of go through the meeting with preliminaries, kind of just forecasting how long that's going to be. So we let them know so that they just kind of, I think it puts people at ease, affirm a strength. So that's MI right there. And not just MI, but affirming a strength. So we want to find those strengths and draw out those, name those strengths we see in the kid, and have the parents name those strengths too, because kids have strengths. Even if they're not coming to school, doesn't make them a bad kid. It's just, there's something going on. And we move into identifying root cause of absenteeism, whatever that is. And that can, as you folks know, and I think as most people working with school absenteeism know, that the cause can vary from student to student. So that's a pretty complex part there, but usually you have some good background with a student before you go into it. So somewhat, at least the direction you need to go with that one. We discussed the impacts of absenteeism. So this is kind of where the MI can start to come out, where you can start interviewing the parent or the kid about what are some of the impacts that you missing school has, and then they could start coming out with, my grades aren't very good. I might get kicked off the wrestling team or something if I don't get my grades up, or I don't start attending. So we want to discuss the impacts. We identified the incentives for education, so things that the student wants. So I know in the example from years ago, the video that you're referring to, the kid was on the wrestling team. He wanted to go to state, so he had incentive to come to school, and we can concentrate on that and use those OARS to hopefully amplify that motivation for him to get to school and come up with a plan. After that, we come up with generate options without evaluating. So really, we just want to put all the options on the table for what the kid can, or what the options for the kid is. Like, go into the ALC. Is that an option? Is changing your course schedule, would that be helpful? Would staying at mom or dad's instead of mom's on these days be helpful? So we're just trying to generate all the options, just put them on this table without going over the pros and cons. And then when we start to select that solution, it's very much them selecting the solution so that they have ownership of that, whatever that plan is. And that's part of that MI of drawing out and evoking, but also giving them that autonomy, the right to choose, right? My plan, I might have a great plan, but it's not going to work for the kid all the time. So giving them the right to choose what that is, and that gives them some better control too. And then we just try to do that, explain consequences. We just want to make people aware, what's going to happen if we can't follow this plan, which is at that point with these TPMs is that would be referred to Pine County. And then we end the meeting because we always want to kind of bring it back to how the meeting was for you, how they feel about the plan going forward. And throughout this whole thing, we're just trying to amplify that change talk, whatever is going to move them closer to being at school more consistently. So we're listening for change talk.
So thank you for laying that out, David. One thing that did stick out to me is kind of the overlap with restorative practices. And it's really tough for us on this podcast not to, jump into a rabbit hole of a whole nother episode, because we should do one about RP itself. But while you were describing the TPM meeting, I noticed there was some overlap to a restorative conference that might happen, for example, after a discipline incident. So there's that empathetic listening similar to the OARS. There's the idea of we need to understand the impact of what's going on or what happened, trying to identify solutions with the student and the family, and then that idea of having collective accountability around the solutions. So would you say that what sets MI apart, at least in that context of a truancy prevention meeting, is that change talk piece? That was just my first, superficial take, but I'm a complete novice, and I'm just curious what you'd say about kind of RP versus MI.
Yeah, I don't think of it as a verse thing. For me, so just to give you some context of what those TPMs are, those were developed by Pine County had contracted with the University of Minnesota through the Center for Restorative Justice and Peacekeeping, I think is right. And so they actually wrote the TPM, and I just enhanced. I would say it's an enhancement with the motivational interviewing in there. So one of the cool things about motivational interviewing is it can be intertwined with a lot of different things, including restorative justice. So the layout really with that TPM is the foundation is really restorative justice. We're just using the motivational interviewing skill sets within there to find those things that are going to help that kid change what's going on.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful, because we often talk with restorative about having people not get too tied up in the rigidity of it. Like it's this rigid sequence and this rigid structure. And it is kind of like a restorative spirit, like you described with motivational interviewing, where the practices can be a little bit flexible, but it's really that philosophy and that spirit that guides kind of what you're going for.
Absolutely.
Well, one thing I also wanted to bring up, David, is we think it's so important for adults to model a growth mindset of persistence, of embracing the struggle when we try new things. So often on the podcast, we try to talk about the first few times that we tried a new practice or a new thing and how we struggled with it, and the pitfalls that we ran into, because we don't want people to get intimidated and drop something when they don't experience success right away, because that's not realistic. So if you wouldn't mind putting on kind of your coaching hat for a second, David, is there anything that you struggled with or had an awkward time with when you were getting started with MI that you'd like to point out and give people a heads up about, and maybe provide some encouragement for people so that they're able to push through that if they give this a try?
Yeah, some of the pitfalls I kind of ran into was probably more my interviewing style. I struggled a lot when I first started to really do this. I noticed that I asked a lot of closed questions. I think I mentioned that earlier, but I found myself, just because I was more aware of it, that a lot of the questions I would be closed questions. Then I would say, why, or tell me more about that. So I kind of make it open, but it wouldn't be as good as an open-ended question. So really just understanding that you want to have those open questions. So for me, at first, if I knew what I would want to talk about or focus on with the kid, I would write down the questions, because I knew my brain would just go to those yes or no's, and then I'd be in that interrogation mode, which is not going to be nearly as helpful. So open questions, getting away from those closed questions was really difficult for me. I think the other part was just I was very rigid with it. I really was trying to practice am I maybe too much to where it became I was not authentic, and authenticity is very important. And for me, I could kind of feel when it was no longer authentic. I wasn't being authentic. So I was very rigid or robotic with the skills of affirmations, reflections, and summarizations. And when you start feeling that, you kind of have to back off the intervention and come back to reality that, there's a relationship here in front of you. You got to be able to engage with that person and not be so robotic, because that authenticity is so important. And I think I didn't know that at first, and I could just kind of feel myself, what I would call is kind of falling out of the spirit of motivational interviewing. And I didn't know that at first, but now I can kind of feel it, and then I just kind of back up and I re-engage with the student, not using motivational interviewing necessarily, but just staying within the spirit of and accepting them here and where we're at right now.
I appreciate that. That reminded me of something that came across when I was trying to research MI ahead of this interview. One description I found of it was kind of, there's a following style to interviewing someone and talking to someone where you're purely kind of reflecting and summarizing and just trying to show them that you're trying to understand what they're thinking and feeling. And then there's a directing style where you're giving them information and advice, and it's very close-ended and kind of, the solution, you're just trying to point them there. And motivational interviewing is trying to be that guiding style, which is somewhere in the middle. It's this balancing where you're helping them go to a place of change, but you're not directing them there. And I think whenever you're trying to do something balanced like that, that's where I've had pitfalls with things. Like, for example, when I was learning about counseling, in undergrad and grad school, and the idea of using reflection and empathy to not give someone advice and not point them to the answer, but to help them find it. Mm-hmm. One of the things that was tricky with that is when there's silence, you want to fill it, and you often fill it with these close-ended questions or this information. That's your first impulse, because you're not as comfortable with silence. Generally, humans really aren't, and you want to jump in and fill that. And also, I think if you're focusing on directing someone, and if you already have the solution in mind that you want to direct them and point them to, you're not listening to them as deeply as you are when you're truly trying to understand them and help them find the change. So I think you're not prepared to ask those really good open-ended questions and reflect and help them get there when you're spending your time half listening to them and half thinking and strategizing how you're going to get them to the destination that you want. And one thing I've heard about MI is that those really powerful conversations happen when the person on the other end, the student in this case, really detects that you are deeply listening to them, because your questions are so good, because you're not focused on the destination you've got pre-planned in your head. You really are focusing on what they are saying in the moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Nick, I think you bring up some good points just with the listening styles, like you mentioned, the following style, the guided style, and the leading style. And one of the things I've had the opportunity to teach the school other school social workers and nurses this year in this. And the analogy I use is like, it's you're in a car and the student is the person driving. The following style, you're kind of in the back seat. You're not really paying attention. I mean, maybe you're looking up once in a while, but you're not paying much attention to what's going on. You're just kind of reflecting on whatever they're saying. You're not leading them. You're not telling them where to go. You're kind of sitting right in the passenger seat, just exploring. Have you tried to go down this road, or have you tried to go down this road, or you did go down that road? Well, what happened when you went down that road? So you're really just trying to guide them. But you have to be able to switch too. To sometimes you got to follow. We want to spend most of our time more in that guided listening, but sometimes you have to fall back on the following the student if that's what they need.
David, I know we're running short on time, but we do want to circle back to that idea of some pre-meeting or pre-interview prep and then follow up of a motivational interview. So could you tell our listeners a little bit about that?
Pre-interview prep. And one of the things you have to think about with whatever the person you're working, the student you're working with, or the client you're working with, is where they are at with that change. And that's going to drive where you think you need to go with that session. So I'm not going to go hard into the skill set of MI. If the student's I'm just trying to engage with the student. I'm trying to form that foundational relationship. I might use those OARS, those open or the affirmations, reflections, and summarizations to enhance the relationship, but I'm not necessarily pointing them towards change with those OARS quite yet. I'm just trying to engage and form that relationship. And kind of like Nick said, like, if I'm doing my OARS right, even though I'm not quite to that, even though if I'm not quite to that actually working towards that change, they're going to feel heard, and that's going to make them feel validated, and that's going to enhance that relationship. So you first have to kind of figure out where you are, and then the prep work, depending on where you are, is what is the focus of this meeting? What do you want this focus to be in this meeting? And you also kind of have to respect their autonomy that they might want to talk about something else too. So giving them the ability or the space to talk about other things too, not just about what I want to talk about. I mean, at the end of the day, I got a job to do, and I tell them that, like, we got to talk about this, but what do you want to talk about? Because this is partly your time, and that's part of the engagement style with MI is you want to give them autonomy, you want to give them that respect and that the dignity to be able to talk about the things they want to talk about. But then, they also kind of have to know that I've got some things I got to talk about too.
So I guess one thing, like the truancy prevention meeting specifically, is what was in my head when we were kind of coming up with this question.
Yep.
And it sounds like, for that to go well, that engagement piece and that relationship piece is a really important ingredient. So maybe if you didn't have as strong of a relationship and as much understanding and engagement with that student, that would be part of your prep and a really important piece you'd have to invest time into before you're sitting at that table with their parent. Where
Right.
like if you have been seeing that student day to day and have a pretty strong relationship with them already, that you wouldn't have to necessarily invest so much time in that before you would be sitting down at that TPM meeting.
Yep. Yeah, depending on the setting or what the meeting's about. Yeah, that's a good point. And with those, you want to have a relationship with that kid before those truancy prevention meetings. You don't want to go into those. You want a relationship with the parent and the kid, actually. You want to have a pretty good understanding of what's been going on, so you can kind of guide that conversation. Again, you're trying to guide them towards the thing that's going to help them change. So in that context, they gotta form that relationship first. You gotta work on that engagement.
And that's similar to restorative practices, at least my experience with it, which one of those is, restorative conferences. You want to talk to the student and the parent and other people often before you sit down at that table all together, so that you can make good use of that time when everyone's together, and so that people feel safe, like they have good relationships with the people around the table. So you have some information, like you said, affirmations early in the meeting, those first steps, like you're kind of where you want to go with it, is one thing I heard with you saying earlier.
Yeah, you definitely want to have a direction.
Yeah. What does that follow-up look like?
With the TPMs, generally when we make a plan, we would write in like a follow-up phase. I'm going to check in with the student or the parent in 3 weeks and check in just to see how this plan is going. And then we can talk. If it's going well, then great. And if it's not going well, we can problem solve again and just come up with a new plan, because plans don't always work out, and it doesn't mean we should just give up. It just means we found, it's that whole Thomas Edison thing, where he had to keep trying to get that light bulb. Like, we had to just keep plugging away, because eventually that light's gonna light up and a click.
I think I read in your outline and saw in the video demo that naming people to those action steps is really helpful. You have a higher likelihood of success with the plan, where it's clear who's going to do what.
Yeah, you want to be pretty explicit about the roles of that, who has what roles in that plan. So, I mean, starting with yourself, like I'm going to be the one that's following up with the student in 3 weeks, or the parent in 3 weeks. But here's the student's role. And some of those things I've had over the years, like, you got to wake up at this time because you got to feed your dog. And if you don't feed your dog's going to be hungry. So that's your job to get up. And that's the way that was kind of a way we could get kids out of bed, because that was often one of the harder parts. Just to use an example, but in that example, the kid had a specific job there that they needed to get out of bed to feed their dog or their cat.
Oh, great. Well, we're gonna wrap things up here, David, and do takeaways and sign off together. It has been tremendous having you here. You're just such a source of knowledge on this, and I know our listeners are really going to appreciate it. Typically I do takeaways and kind of do our summary at the end of the episode, but I wonder if you could grace us with kind of talking through maybe that spirit again, to just refresh us and circle back to that, because I think it sounds like that's what it's all about, is, not too much getting tied into the rigidity, but really trying to keep with that spirit of MI. Yeah.
So just to kind of go through the spirit again, you want to be grounded in the spirit to really do MI effectively. And if you follow the spirit, I guess the trainer that I have, he would say that if you're not in the spirit when you're using the tools, it would be unethical. It's like manipulation. To give an example, a lot of the stuff that we're using in MI, people in sales also use. Like, if a person in sales, if I went to buy a car and I said, oh, I really like the leather seats, in this car, but I don't know about the trunk space. They would be inclined, or it would be to their benefit to really to amplify what I like about the car. So they'd say, well, these leather seats, I'll tell you, they got heat warmers, or they got coolers. So the skill set is it's in different types of occupation. So if you're not in the spirit, it can become manipulation, and you don't want that. So really, we're looking for partnership. We're working with the person. So that's one of the pillars, partnership. We're working with the person, not over the person, not the authority. We want to work with them so that they can come up with their own solution. Acceptance, and the acceptance of their autonomy, that they have the right to choose what they're going to do and what they're not going to do. And I'll tell you, mental health wise, this has been really liberating for me, because once I have that acceptance, and they do something that might make somebody upset that they did that, I can kind of step back and say, well, that's who they are. And I can start to separate the sin from the sinner. Like that's what they did. But that's not who they are. And if I can accept that, then that's going to keep me grounded in that spirit. Compassion, just kind of accept, and that's just, compassion for the person. I don't want to ramble on too long about it, but it goes back to Carl Rogers and kind of his work with that unconditional positive regard of a person, that a person is divine just because they are a person. So having compassion for that. And then evocation, that we want to evoke from them why they want to change. Our reasons for change aren't good. Their reasons for them changing are a lot better. So evoking from them what they want.
Thank you so much, David. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, David, thank you so much for spending time with us today. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in on this episode of Motivational Interviewing. Make sure to subscribe. And if you're on YouTube, click the bell so that you're notified when new episodes are released each week. We'll see you when you come back for another slice of SEL.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Bye.